nice turnout. What a nice turnout, as I've been talking. So delighted to have you here. Those of you who were here last year know about our program and her ability to make music. So last year, as some of you may remember who were here, Asi devoted her program to Russian composers, including Rachmaninoff, Glinka, and Tchaikovsky. Today, however, she has made it Beethoven's Day. Ludwig van Beethoven, just a little bit about him before we start. Known even by people not too knowledgeable as one of the three B's, was born in Bonn in the Electorate of Cologne, the Principality of the Holy Roman Empire, on or about 1760. His exact date is uncertain, but he was baptized on December 17, 1770, and so it is assumed that he was probably born on the 16th of December. Ludwig was the grandson of Ludwig van Beethoven, a musician from Mechelen in present-day Belgium, who later moved to Bonn. Ludwig's father, Johann van Beethoven, somewhat of an alcoholic, was also a court singer and musician who became his musically talented son's first teacher. Johann, however, was a harsh instructor who made Ludwig often stand at the keyboard in tears. His cruelty affected Ludwig for the rest of his life. Johann wanted his son to be recognized as a musical prodigy like Mozart, but while Ludwig played impressively at his debut recital before the Empress Maria Theresa, his recitals received no press, unlike what happened to Mozart. A poor student, he withdrew from school at the age of 10 to study music full-time with Christian Gottlob Lief, the newly appointed court organist who wrote about him, quote, "If he continues like this, he will be, without a doubt, a new Mozart." In 1787, the court sent Beethoven to Vienna to study with Mozart in an effort to facilitate his musical development. Mozart said of him, quote, "Keep your eyes on him. Someday he will give the world something to talk about." Isn't that the truth? After only a few weeks in Vienna, however, he learned that his mother was gravely ill, and he rushed home to Bonn. Her death, several months later, sent Beethoven into a fit of depression lasting several years. In 1792, with French revolutionary forces sweeping across the Rhineland into the Electorate of Cologne, Beethoven decided to leave Cologne and return to Vienna. Mozart had died a year earlier, leaving Joseph Haydn as the unquestioned greatest living composer. Beethoven dedicated himself to studying with the most eminent musicians of the age, studying piano with Haydn, vocal composition with Antonio Salieri, and counterpoint with Johann Thalbergsberger. Through his reputation as a virtuoso pianist, he won many patrons among leading Viennese citizens who provided him with lodging and funds, which allowed him to sever his connection with the Electorate of Bonn. He made his long-awaited public debut in Vienna on March 9, 1795. While there is some debate as to which of his early piano concertos he performed that night, most scholars believe he played what is known as his first piano concerto in C minor. In the first spring of the new century, on April 2, 1800, Beethoven debuted Symphony No. 1 in C major at the Royal Imperial Theatre in Vienna. Although Beethoven would grow to detest the piece, he remarked sometime later, "In those days, I did not know how to compose." In 1804, only after Napoleon named himself emperor, Beethoven debuted his Symphony No. 3, his grandest and most original work to date, and dedicated it in Napoleon's honor. However, when he later became disillusioned with Napoleon, the symphony was renamed the Eroica Symphony, and the Eroica was so unlike anything heard before that the musicians could not figure out how to play it. Yet, a prominent reviewer proclaimed it as, quote, "one of the most original, most sublime, and most profound products the entire genre of music has ever exhibited." By the turn of the century, Beethoven began to lose his hearing and struggled to come to terms with this fact. In a letter to his friend von Weber, he wrote, "I must confess that I lead a miserable life. For almost 2 years, I have ceased to attend any social functions just because I find it impossible to say to people, 'I am deaf.' If I had any other profession, I might be able to cope with my infirmity. But in my profession, it is a terrible handicap. From 1803 to 1812, despite his rapidly increasing deafness, he continued to compose superlatively complex, beautiful, original compositions at a furious pace, including his only opera Fidelio, 6 symphonies, 4 solo concerti, 5 string quartets, 6 string sonatas, 7 piano sonatas, 5 sets of piano variations, 4 overtures, 4 trios, 2 sextets, and 72 songs. While bringing so much beautiful music to the world, Beethoven was a lonely and frequently miserable man throughout his life, adult life. He was short-tempered, absent-minded, greedy, and suspicious to the point of paranoia. He feuded with his brothers, his publishers, his housekeepers, his pupils, and his patrons. In one notable incident, he attempted to break a chair over the head of Prince Lichnowsky, one of his closest friends and patrons. For reasons that included his crippling shyness and physical appearance, he never married or had children. He was, however, very much in love with a married woman named Anthony Brentano, to whom he wrote love letters which he never sent. Beethoven died on March 26, 1827, at the age of 56. Summing up his life in imminent death during his last days, Beethoven, who was never as eloquent with his words as with his music, borrowed a line which concluded many Latin plays of the time. Plaudite amici, commedia finita est, he said. Applaud, friends, the comedy is over. Today, we will have the pleasure of hearing some samples of this great but troubled composer's beautiful music, thanks to Asya and friends. We have everybody up on stage ready to go, so I will just give you a brief, let you know who is going to be performing, because we said friends, but we know who they are. Asya, who some of you who were not here last year want to know a little bit about Asya as well. Is a member of our congregation, and we're so lucky to have her here. She graduated with honors from Kharkov Music College and Conservatory in Ukraine, worked as head of the piano department of a major music school there, in addition to being accompanist to violinists, cellists, and musical trios and quartets. Some of her 50 students following in Asya's footsteps have become piano teachers and performers, and are now teaching and performing in Ukraine, Russia, the United States, Germany, England, Italy, Denmark, Spain, and Israel. Since coming to the United States, Asya has spent much of her time accompanying the B'nai B'rith choir, performing for the residents of B'nai B'rith apartments and the Daughters of Sarah Nursing Home, the Jewish Community Center, and Westview apartments, in addition to having graced us last year with the performance of Lunch and Learn. Last year, she graciously had performed music by Russian composers, and thanks to the many kudos she received, she has agreed to do another concert here again this time. And this time it will be all Beethoven. We also have Svetlana Baratz, please. Mrs. Baratz is a graduate of Kern School of Music. Prior to coming to the U.S., she performed in Russia as both a solo and a duet concert pianist. However, piano is now her hobby, since she holds a doctorate degree in dentistry from the University of Pittsburgh and is maintaining a private general dental practice in Albany near St. Peter's Hospital. Mrs. Baratz has 2 wonderful children, both of whom play musical instruments. Isabel, who's here today too. Isabel, please. Isabel is the one who will be performing today. Isabel Baratz, one of Mrs. Baratz's 2 musical children, is a 6th grade student at Doane Stewart School, an excellent student to receive high honors for the current year. Isabel began playing the piano in 1st grade, and besides enjoying music, singing, and performing, she also enjoys gymnastics. Please welcome Isabel, and then she will be playing later. We also have Daniel Levchenko. Daniel? He's 14 years old and a student at Shaker High School. In addition to playing the piano, he plays the saxophone, performs in 2 orchestras, enjoys sports, particularly running. Daniel currently studies with his older sister Oksana, and so there we have, then we have Daniel's brother Benjamin. Benjamin Lachenko is a 10-year-old student at Boat Hill School. In addition to studying the piano, he also plays the cello. Like his brother Daniel, Benjamin performs with orchestras at his school and in their church. He also studies music with his sister Oksana. And so now we're ready to begin the program. First we hear the Sonata Pathétique, which I think Asya is playing. Was written in 1798 when Beethoven was 27 years old. It was dedicated to his friend Prince Karl von Lichnowsky, the same friend whose head he attempted to break with a chair. Although he calmly thought it would be one of the few works to be named by the composer himself, it was actually named Grand Sonate Pathétique by the publisher who was impressed by the sonata's tragic sonority. Asya, please. Thank you, Arthur. I'm breathless. On to our next performer, the young lady that I introduced to you earlier. Her name is Isabel Baraz, who will be playing the minuet in G major. This minuet is a composition originally written for orchestra, but it was lost, and now only an arrangement for piano exists. And we're very thankful that Isabel is here to perform it for us. Thank you, Isabel. Here we have the future of classical music. Next we'll hear Daniel Ovchenko playing Sonatina in F major. Since this work was published in Hamburg, Germany after Beethoven's death, its authenticity is sometimes doubted as it uses the style of Beethoven that he used before, but here it is. Thank you. part two of this Valentina is being played by Beethoven. And we've already talked about what this piece was about, and so now we'll hear the second part two. Thank you. Wonderful to see these young people, doing what they do and do so well. Thank you. Next on our program is the Moonlight Sonata. This piano sonata, one of Beethoven's most popular for the piano, was written in 1801 and dedicated to Beethoven's pupil, Countess Giulietta Guiccardi. 4 years before his death, Beethoven confessed to his friend that he was in love with the Countess at the time he wrote this sonata. It appears to have quite a few loves, mostly unrequited. Sad for Beethoven, but wonderful for us, so we can hear the Moonlight Sonata. So, yeah, thank you. Beethoven would have been very proud. Without any more, I guess, we're going on to Furley's, and without any rest, I still will be playing Furley's, a piece that was composed in 1810 when Beethoven was practically deaf. There are different versions regarding dedication. Researchers say that it was originally dedicated for Therese, and dedicated to Therese L'Enfant, a student and friend with whom he was in love and who turned him down, as he said before, when he proposed to her. Some are saying that it was dedicated to an opera singer friend named Elizabeth Russell, whom he met a few years before writing this piece. Whatever it is, I think it's one we're all pretty much familiar with, Furley's. Please, Asya. Thank you. Written before 1804 and between 1804 and 1808, the Symphony No. 5 is one of the best-known compositions in classical music and one of the most frequently played. Groundbreaking in terms of both its technical and its emotional impact, the Fifth has had a large influence on composers and music critics and inspired works by such composers as Brahms, Tchaikovsky, his Fourth Symphony in particular, Mahler, and Berlioz. And now, please welcome Svetlana Baratz to the piano. And